Guys, I have a little confession to make here that will probably make people call me quite a boomer. I kinda miss the old Dragon Ball style fights. I know, I'm old, I'm boring, yada yada. Just hear me out for a bit, okay? By no means do I dislike the fights in the latter half of Z and Super. Have you seen Goku vs Jiren, or Goku 17 and Frieza vs Jiren, or Vegeta vs Toppo? That shit was fire, like no doubt about it. But I just can't seem to help myself from missing the older fights where techniques were just much more special. Like, some of my favorite fights in the franchise are Goku vs Tien at the 22nd World Tournament, Yamcha vs Kami at the 21st World Tournament, or Hero, however you want to call him, depending on what dub you watched or what sub you watched. Kami vs Piccolo at the 24th World Tournament, Goku vs Piccolo at the 24th World Tournament. Yeah, you might have noticed this already, but I really like the 24th World Tournament arc. I think it's one of the best, if not just straight up the best arc in all of Dragon Ball. But I also really loved fights like Goku vs Frieza and Goku vs Cell from a little bit later in Z. The thing that really separates these older fights from the more modern fights we see in Super is that the actual fight choreography, which is a term used to refer to the way the flow of the fight progresses over time, is in my opinion at least much better in the earlier parts of Dragon Ball. And secondly, the fact that the focus of a lot of these older fights lies much more on actual martial arts rather than just overpowering each other with powerful ki attacks. But that second point is something I cannot be too upset about, because it really is just the natural progression of Dragon Ball which causes this. But to revert back a bit to that first point, let's just take a look at this scene from the fight between Goku and Piccolo during the World Tournament, where Goku uses his so-called meteor combination. This scene is commonly regarded as one of the best moments in all of Dragon Ball, and I completely agree, because it's for a good reason. The flow of Goku's punches, the impact behind them, the way Piccolo is depicted as completely defenseless, everything is just perfect. Like, there's really not a single bad aspect about this, other than you might say, oh, it's not like super modernly animated, but yeah, like it's decades old. What do you expect? Now, as a comparison, let's grab one of the more modern fights from Dragon Ball Super. Let's use Goku vs Hit from the Universe 6 versus Universe 7 arc. Roll the clip. What the? For me personally, these two fights are leagues apart from one another, with Goku vs Piccolo absolutely dominating the charts. Whilst the fight between Goku and Hit is not what I would call bad, it's just less of an actual fight and more so an exchange of attacks. And that probably sounded like I just said the same thing twice, but the fight between Goku and Piccolo feels much more like a fight for two reasons if you were to ask me. Reason one being that the fight choreography is simply much better in early Dragon Ball and Z. I don't think you can really argue against this, but this also does not mean that Super does not have great fights in it. Like I said before, Goku, Frieza and 17 vs Jiren and Goku vs Rose Goku Black are great examples of well choreographed fights, for example in Dragon Ball Super. But the fight between Goku and Hit does not really have this flow embedded in it. Rather than a fight, it feels more like I attack with my special move. Okay, then I counter with my special move. Ha! You fool! I have a special move which is even better than my previous special move, and so on. Where are the punches? Where are the actual like bouts of combat? I very much miss these aspects when looking at some of the fights in Dragon Ball Super. And the second reason why Goku vs Piccolo absolutely shits on this fight is because it felt a lot more visceral. You could really feel the stakes and the impact of the attacks. Now, this can be disregarded as something that, you know, it's the art style. One very big downside of the art direction in Super specifically is that the attacks just feel weaker because the impact is just less present. When you compare the artwork of Dragon Ball Super to something like Dragon Ball and early Dragon Ball Z, well, I mean, the entirety of Dragon Ball Z really, Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z just feel a lot more grungy, like there's more scribbled lines, there's more exaggerated expressions. Like, in comparison, Dragon Ball Super just feels a lot more stiff and clean, if that makes any sense to you. For example, that gut punch Goku gave Piccolo felt a hell of a lot more impactful and heavy than the entire Universe 6 versus Universe 7 arcs combined. But once again, I will say that this is pretty dependent on the animation style and the animators themselves, obviously. Super's animation style just lacks that more grungy feeling that the older iterations of Dragon Ball had, which is one of the more noticeable negatives in regards to fully digital art. It's more, well, it's literally more difficult to get a grungy and paper feel to modern art because it's drawn digitally. And then there is also the fact that these animators are so crunched on time that you really can't expect them to make everything look perfect. And that's an issue with every single anime nowadays, really, because the way these time schedules work for these animators, it's really bad. Like, I can tell you that. I don't have super inside knowledge or whatever, but every time you hear a story, it's pretty bad. Like, no arguing needs to be done about that. But let's move on to that second point I mentioned earlier on in this video. Ki-based combat has become more than just a unique attack. Taking the fight between Tien and Goku during the 22nd World Tournament as the example this time around, the times they use ki-based attacks or special techniques actually make the techniques feel special. The majority of the fight is focused around actual martial arts and actual combat. In more modern iterations of Dragon Ball, the gang throws a few weak-looking punches and then just switches over to spamming ki attacks for the rest of the fight. Now, obviously, take what I just said with a grain of salt because I was generalizing quite a bit there, but the point still stands. Back in the good old days, a big ki attack was something special. It was akin to an actual ultimate move in a video game, whilst nowadays they feel more like your basic attacks. But this was really always the inevitable outcome of the story progression from Dragon Ball. The stronger characters get, the less impactful their martial arts will appear, if that makes any sense. Take for example, merge Zamasu versus Goku, Vegeta and Trunks. Zamasu as a god level, just universal level fighter, just wouldn't seem fitting in the tier of power he is in if he just threw punches and kicks. It would just not feel right, if that makes sense. Like, we have been conditioned that ki-based attacks are the new normal fighting due to the gaps in power in relation to earlier fights. It's much easier to show how strong somebody is if they just throw a massive ki attack rather than just throwing a very heavy punch. Like, at least it feels that way to me. However, once this motion was set in stone, the disappearance of actual martial arts from the series was pretty much inevitable, and I use the word disappearance there, but it's obviously not entirely gone, but it has definitely declined in usage. But once again, that was a generalized statement because it's not like it will ever be completely removed from the series. At least that seems highly doubtable to me. Like, I don't see it happening. Even in the modern iteration of Super, we can see some of it shine through the cracks, and who knows, maybe Daima will actually introduce a lot more actual martial arts rather than ki attacks. Because in most of Super, it is generally overwhelmed with the flashy ki-based attacks we see in every single fight. And combine this with the general lesser amounts of fighting choreography and you just get more generic template fights, which returns all the way back to the beginning of this video. I personally do miss the older fights from the franchise, but don't take this as me saying that the newer fights are bad. Seeing huge energy attacks clash with each other is still pretty awesome. Like, just look at Gogeta's Kamehameha from the Broly movie. Like, that gave me like chicken skin. It was incredibly good. But I would just really like to thank you all for listening to an old man whine about nostalgia and old stuff and blah blah blah. If you liked today's video, be sure to leave a like, subscribe and hit the bell icon to never miss another video ever again. Work hard, study well and eat and sleep plenty, and I will see you all again in the next video. Peace out.